Is paneer a vegetable? Think carefully, because the answer to that question is more important to Indian history than you might believe. Let me explain. What is the definition of vegetarian food? I bet even if you can't think of an exact definition, if you went to a restaurant and looked at a menu, you would be able to tell which dishes were vegetarian and which were not. Paneer tikka, veg. Tomato soup, veg. Mushroom masala, veg. Chicken stew with carrots and potatoes, that's non-veg. But paneer is not really a vegetable. Neither are tomatoes or mushrooms, actually, if you think about it. But they're still considered vegetarian food. The chicken stew has the most actual vegetables in it, but as soon as you add one piece of chicken, it becomes non-veg. So basically, the definition of vegetarian food has nothing to do with vegetables. Vegetarian food is just food that doesn't have any meat in it. This is a negative definition. It doesn't say what veg food is, it says what veg food is not. So what does this all have to do with history? Well, I'm glad you asked. Basically, when the British ruled India, they divided everyone in the country into two categories. There were Muslims, and everyone who wasn't Muslim was automatically put into a category called Hindu. This included Sikhs, Jains, Buddhists, various indigenous tribes, Dalits, Brahmins, and every caste in between. Now, all of these groups did form a society of sorts, a caste society. But did Brahmins and Dalits really think of themselves as belonging to the same religion? Not really. When the word Hindu was first used, it didn't refer to a religion. It was a Persian word used to describe people who lived near or beyond the Indus River. So while the word had been in use before the British arrived, the idea that it referred to a single religion followed by everyone except Muslims seems to have only become popular after their arrival. So if all of these people didn't call themselves Hindu and they had no conception of a shared religion, then where does Hinduism come from? What was its relationship with caste? How did it become the religion of the majority? And how did it change Indian politics? Let's get into some history. In 1757, the British conquered Bengal. However, before they could actually rule over it, they needed to create a legal system to decide things like who owned land, who was responsible for paying taxes on it, who the land would belong to when the owner died or if they got married, and so on. Before British rule, these questions were largely decided by communities based on local customs. So the rules varied across regions, castes, and subcastes. Basically, it was complicated. The British wanted something simpler and more uniform, so that they could collect taxes more efficiently. So in 1772, Warren Hastings, the then Governor-General of Bengal, announced that the British would create a new system of courts to handle all of these land-related issues. The British believed that for Indians, religion was the defining part of their identity. So the courts had two systems of law. Muslims were to be judged according to Islamic law derived from the Quran. Everyone else was to be judged according to what the British called Hindu law. But as we've said before, there was no real definition for the word Hindu. The people in the Hindu category had different gods, rituals, customs, and ways of life. But just like how Muslims had the Quran and Christians had the Bible, the British were looking for a religious book on which to base Hindu law. Their Brahmin advisors offered them the Dharma Shastras, which were Sanskrit texts that contained various rules for living an ideal life. We've probably heard of the most famous of these books, the Manusmriti. Brahmins wrote these texts. Historically, Brahmins were the only ones allowed to read them. Brahmins helped to translate them into English. And when British courts got confused by the many contradictions in these books, Brahmins were hired to make sense of them. I know I'm saying the word Brahmin a lot here, but we're trying to make a point. They were a tiny minority, just 6% of all Hindus at the time. But they commanded a lot of power in society. And these texts helped solidify that power. They glorified Brahmins and other upper castes as superior beings, justified horrific discrimination against lower castes, and promoted untouchability. But somehow, Brahmins convinced the British that these texts were not an exploitative manifesto spread by a powerful elite, but rather something that all Hindus saw as the foundation of society. While these claims were mostly accepted by the British, there were a few skeptics even among them. Henry Sumner Maine, a colonial administrator and one of the foremost legal experts at that time, said the Manusmriti is, quote, certainly a Brahmin compilation. It does not as a whole represent a set of rules ever actively administered in Hindustan. According to him, the Manusmriti just described what the Brahmins ideally wanted the law to be. Having a uniform Hindu legal system was very beneficial for the British. It made governance easier, and they could claim they were following the laws of the natives. As for the Brahmins, they already held immense power in the existing caste society, and now the version of Hindu society that they presented to the British ensured that they retained that power and possibly even increased it. It was a win-win for everyone involved, except for the lower castes, tribal groups, and other marginalized communities whose lives it completely disrupted. A great example of this is the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act of 1856. At the time, widow remarriage was quite common among many lower caste and tribal communities. Brahmin and other upper caste communities, on the other hand, did not allow women to remarry when their husbands died. Widows often lived the rest of their lives as virtual slaves. This was one of the many ways in which women's bodies were controlled to maintain caste purity. But some English-educated Brahmin men thought that the treatment of widows was unjust and campaigned against it. They convinced the British to legalize widow remarriage. But to appease men who were afraid of losing their family wealth to outsiders, the law stated that any widow who remarried could not keep any wealth or property she had inherited from her first husband. But importantly, the new law didn't just apply to upper castes who had restrictions against widow remarriage. It applied to everyone who now fell into this new legal category of Hindu, including lower caste communities that had previously allowed widow remarriage. So now, widows from these communities found they had to choose between marriage and keeping their wealth, where before they could have both. As a result, widow remarriage reduced among lower castes. The irony is that widow remarriage remained rare among upper caste widows as well. Basically, the stigma against it was too great for a mere law to overcome. And this is sort of how the creation of the modern Hindu religion began. The British tried to find shortcuts to govern a complicated, diverse country that they didn't really understand, and their Brahmin advisors took advantage of this situation. They preserved and deepened their power over Indian society, and in the process, their religious texts became official laws for British India. Even though they claim that there was a universal religious law that applied to all Hindus, even Brahmins did not really believe in a common Hindu religion that unified all the various castes and communities. In fact, around at the same time that Hindu law was being codified, Brahmins and other upper castes were asserting that they were fundamentally different and better than the rest of the other Hindus. In 1847, a German Sanskrit scholar named Friedrich Max Müller published a translation of the Rig Veda. He stated that Sanskrit shared common roots with certain European languages. And based on this discovery, European scholars developed the theory that Europeans and Indians descended from common ancestors, a group they called the Aryans. This Aryan theory was endorsed by the colonial government. In the aftermath of the Mutiny of 1857, the British were looking for ways to strengthen their rule in India. They used the Aryan theory to make colonization seem more bearable to Indians. Basically, British intellectuals tried to create a new narrative for colonial rule. Instead of foreigners exploiting a faraway nation, they were now a brother civilization, uplifting a long-lost part of the family. European and Brahmin scholars began to produce books that rewrote the subcontinent's history using this Aryan theory. These books spoke of how the Aryans had brought the Hindu faith and civilization to India. But of course, not all Indians were descendants of the Aryans, just the twice-born upper castes. The lower castes were depicted as dark-skinned barbarians who were conquered by the Aryans, and the caste system was supposedly created to avoid the mixing of the two groups. Addressing an American audience in California, Swami Vivekananda said, "The Hindus believed there was only one civilized race, the Aryan." He explained that the Aryan desire for caste purity was no different from white Americans refusing to mix with black and Native Americans. And he wasn't alone. Many famous Indian leaders from Bal Gangadhar Tilak to S. Radhakrishnan held similar views. In fact, Tilak, the spiritual father of modern Hindutva, wrote a whole book about how the Aryans brought the Vedas to India from the North Pole. M.S. Golwalkar, the famous RSS leader, went a step further. He claimed that the North Pole was once in India. This Aryan theory was also the basis of organizations such as the Arya Samaj, an upper caste reform movement that wanted to take Hinduism back to its Vedic and Aryan roots. The Samaj didn't even want to be associated with the word Hindu because of its Persian origin. Instead, its members wanted to be called Aryas. At the same time, lower caste movements used the same Aryan theory to fight back and assert their own claims to political power. Leaders like Jyotirao Phule in Maharashtra and Ayodhyadas and Periyar in Tamil Nadu claimed that the upper caste were Aryan outsiders who had built the caste system to oppress the lower castes the true natives of the Indian subcontinent. In 1909, Kisan Faguji Bansode, a Dalit leader from Maharashtra, highlighted how Dalits were outside mainstream upper caste Hinduism, saying, "The Aryans, your ancestors, conquered us and gave us unbearable harassment. You treated us even worse than slaves. But now we are no longer your subject. We have had enough of the harassment and torture of the Hindus." So, to summarize everything that we've said so far, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the modern religion of Hinduism was constructed according to Brahminical values. This happened in two ways. First, in the process of creating a new legal system, the British and the upper caste collaborated to create the category and identity of Hindu. And second, through the Aryan theory, they gave this religion a glorious history, a history that helped the British justify their rule over India and also emphasize the special status of Brahmins and upper castes within Hinduism. So, the legal and historical basis of modern Hinduism was in place by the late 19th century. But unless you were an intellectual reading history books or were fighting a case in the court, you didn't really have to engage with these ideas directly. They didn't affect your life until the introduction of the census of India in 1871. The mutiny of 1857 had scared the British. They now wanted to gather more information about India's population so that they could strengthen their rule. And the census would achieve that by counting every single inhabitant of India and collecting data on them, including their religious and caste identities. As we mentioned earlier, India's new legal system was based on the idea that religion was a person's primary identity and that everybody had to belong to one religion or another. The census forced that logic onto every person in India. But many communities didn't have a clear definition for their religion. For example, in the 1911 census, several communities identified as Hindu Mohammedan. But in the 1921 census, they were forced into either one category or the other. Apart from categorizing people, the other main purpose of the census was to count them. As a result, the size of each religious community came to be known for the first time. The 1871 census confirmed that Hindus formed the majority, accounting for 73% of the population. But senior census officials repeatedly stated that they didn't have any confidence in the accuracy of the data as there was no clear definition of the Hindu category. Even as the definition of Hindu remained unclear, all this categorizing and counting enabled the creation of something that the Indian society had never seen before: religious identities that were standardized across the whole country. Even though it was caste, which had overwhelmingly determined how communities interacted with each other before, it was made into a secondary identity, and the grand banner of religious identity became all important. And even though upper castes were numerical minorities, because they were powerful and educated, they became the spokespersons for their religions and then used that position to accrue political power. So, in 1906, upper caste Muslim leaders used the fact that Muslims were 21% of the population to argue that Muslims should have representation as per the size of their population in all aspects of governance. The British agreed and created special Muslim seats in legislatures, university boards, and other government institutions. Upper caste Hindus who had spent most of the previous century stressing how different they were from other Hindus now realized that they stood to gain much more if they insisted that all Hindus were a single unified group. Ahead of the 1911 census, the new Census Commissioner Edward Gate laid out 10 criteria that could be used to define a Hindu. The criteria was based on how closely a community's way of life and customs resembled the Brahminical way of life, which the British assumed was the truest form of Hinduism. But when these criteria were used, it quickly became clear that a large number of people who were considered Hindu up till then did not actually fit into that category. This caused a huge political uproar. Upper caste leaders realized that if lower castes were excluded from the so-called Hindu community, its numbers would come down drastically, leaving them exposed as a minority. In the end, the uproar forced Gate to withdraw his criteria, but these events caused a complete reversal in the views of the upper castes. Since their political relevance was at stake, they pushed all talk of Aryan supremacy to the background and abruptly switched to constructing the image of a unified, happy Hindu community. Lala Lajpat Rai, a co-founder of the Hindu Mahasabha, wrote in 1915 that the Gate Circular had a quite unexpected effect and galvanized the dying body of Orthodox Hinduism into sympathy with its untouchable population, because that was so necessary to avert its own downfall. Caste reform suddenly became a prominent part of every party's political program. The Congress passed a resolution against untouchability for the first time in 1920. The Hindu Mahasabha got involved as well. They proclaimed that the so-called untouchables could drink from public wells, study in schools, and enter temples, but they still couldn't eat with upper caste or read the Vedas. But all of these efforts were quite weak. Rather than dismantling the caste system, upper caste leaders were just trying to reorganize it slightly. But by the end of the 1920s, a young Dalit scholar was rapidly emerging as a major political force and was popularizing a very different demand. Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar was arguing for the total annihilation of caste. To achieve that goal, Dalits needed political power. Ambedkar believed that upper caste leaders couldn't be trusted to represent Dalit interests, and so he fought for separate electorates, special seats in the legislature for which only Dalits could contest and vote. But Gandhi strongly opposed the move, arguing that it would lead to the breakup of Hindu society. He threatened to fast unto death if Ambedkar did not give up his demands. So despite the British having accepted his proposal, Ambedkar had to back down and sign the infamous Pune Pact, which took away separate electorates and replaced them with reserved seats. The difference was that while only Dalits could contest for these seats, upper caste could also vote in these elections. This meant that Dalit candidates who were not acceptable to upper caste always ended up losing. Thus, Dalits were integrated into the Hindu fold in order to create a Hindu electoral majority. And since the upper caste controlled all the political parties, this meant that they held all the power. There is a pattern to these events, one that continuously repeats in modern Indian history. Upper castes capture power and wield it against lower castes. And whenever that power is threatened, like with the Gate Circular or the demand for Dalit electorates, there is a backlash. It happens whenever lower caste groups assert their identities and talk about the injustices of the caste system. The aim of this backlash is always to hide caste and other divides and force Hindus back into some kind of unified identity. There is no better example of this than the events that took place after reservations for OBCs was implemented in 1991 based on the recommendations of the Mandal Commission. Violent anti-reservation protests were organized all over the country in response. But the real reaction to these new reservations, according to political scientist Christoph Jaffrelot, was the Ram Mandir movement, which picked up pace just a few months later. L.K. Advani set off on a Rath Yatra across India, giving communally charged speeches before finally arriving at Ayodhya on December 6, 1992, with a small army of angry men to demolish the Babri Masjid. Essentially, much like Ambedkar's demands for separate electorates for Dalits, the Mandal Commission's recommendations had threatened to make OBCs see themselves not merely as less fortunate members of a mighty Hindu majority, but as a deliberately oppressed lower caste majority dominated by a tiny upper caste minority. The Ram Mandir movement worked to bring those castes back under the Hindu umbrella, to make them identify with their Hindu-Ness more than their caste. And it seems to have worked. This pivotal moment in Indian history arguably laid the foundation for the BJP's current dominance of Indian politics, where the focus on Muslims as a common enemy distracts Hindus from the question of caste. Whether it is the Congress or the BJP or any other party in power, the Indian government continues the British formula of identifying people primarily based on their religion. India stopped collecting data on upper caste and OBCs immediately after independence. In the 2011 census, the UPA government collected data on caste, but this data was never released. The BJP continues to suppress it. Their reasoning is that the data is flawed and has so many mistakes that it's not useful. But, as many anti-caste activists have argued, the real reason is that it would threaten the idea of a unified Hindu majority. In independent India, upper castes are a numerical minority, but they completely dominate politics, the judiciary, the media, and corporate boards. In short, every source of power. They have used the Hindu identity to sweep this inequality and oppression under the carpet for the last 250 years. In 2021, the demand for a caste census is once again gathering political momentum. A comprehensive caste census will not dismantle the caste system on its own, but the data that it provides could be a vital first step in understanding how far India needs to go to achieve real social justice.